I want to talk today about PFI, Private Finance Initiative funding for public services, public infrastructure. So this Labour government seems to want to make references to Tony Blair's government as much as possible. Just today, they are harking back to an old theme tune that was the Blair theme tune in the last Labour government. And PFI is something where they really shouldn't be harking back. They really should be recognising the mistakes that were made and not repeating them. And I think it's quite scary that at the moment there are quite a lot of noises being made about using PFI funding and about how we have to have the private sector. And it is all nonsense. It is perfectly possible for this country to invest in its own infrastructure without relying on the private sector. If you fund public services like hospitals, schools, prisons through very expensive loans with the private sector where they receive a huge amount of interest over many, many years, of course you are being ripped off. You're effectively going begging bowl in hand to the private sector, asking for them to rip you off when you could have just paid for this investment directly yourself. So our research shows that on average, NHS trusts in England who have a current PFI debt will have paid back almost 8 times the initial capital PFI put into their trusts. And Essex Partnership University NHS Foundation Trust has the worst payback ratio. They will pay back 27 times what they borrowed. There is 44 billion left to pay across 80 PFI trusts. And so this money could be used, this money that is still owed in debt from agreements that were agreed back in under Tony Blair, that money could be used to clear the repairs backlog, to improve our NHS hospitals. The New Statesman has also found that NHS trusts are spending up to 13% of their income on PFI debts, and that they are spending more in many cases on PFI than they are on medicine for patients. The government can invest directly, they can create money, they can use public sector borrowing, which is far cheaper than private sector borrowing, and they can also introduce a wealth tax to create more money. It is now well established that PFI is a rip-off. It was established in 2011 when a Treasury committee confirmed that PFI was not value for money. It was established in 2018 when the then Conservative Chancellor Philip Hammond explained that PFI was not good value for money and that it didn't even pass on risk to the private sector. So the former head of the NHS, Amanda Pritchard, was actually calling for private finance funding in the NHS, which is absolutely disastrous. She has now been replaced with an interim head of the NHS, James Mackey. And I've been trying to understand where James Mackey might be coming from when he's looking at this issue. Interestingly, back in 2014, James Mackey was involved in extricating Northumberland NHS Trust from a PFI deal. So he knows, really, he seems to understand, this guy, that PFI is really bad news, that it's not value for money. And as I say, he managed to help withdraw this trust from its PFI deal so that it could provide better patient care. So Newcastle Hospital's NHS Trust still owes a 1.1 billion PFI bill, and it is going to end up paying back the initial £298 million investment nearly 6 times over. The payments for the project transforming Newcastle's hospitals began back in 2007, and the bill will not be settled until 2043. Why do we think we're so poor that we can't just pay for this stuff outright and avoid paying for an investment 6 times over? So If Jim Mackey has been paying attention, he will have seen what has been happening in Newcastle, and he should be looking at the whole of the NHS and saying, we don't want any more PFI, we don't want any more hugely expensive mortgage type arrangements where we have to pay over and over and over again for the same investment. We should be recognising that when we need to buy things for patients, we just buy things. When we need to invest, we just invest. So Lord Darcy, who carried out a review of the NHS, which was published in the autumn, said that the NHS has been starved of capital, and that is a huge part of why patients aren't getting the care that they need. Buildings are literally crumbling, and Darcy describes it like this. We have crumbling buildings, mental health patients being accommodated in Victoria-era cells infested with vermin, with 17 men sharing 2 showers and parts of the NHS operating in decrepit porter cabins. 20% of the primary care estates predates the founding of the health service in 1948. So we desperately need this investment. It makes absolutely no sense to involve new PFI in building the buildings and updating the infrastructure that the NHS needs, or schools, or prisons, any buildings in the public sector. PFI has already been shown and agreed by Conservatives to be a massive waste of money. So if this government rehashes and repeats and revives Tony Blair's PFI, it will be betraying us all. He says, I don't pretend that there aren't still enormous challenges because of the size of the capital shortfall. So I'm actually very sympathetic to the argument that we should try and leverage in private finance. The big caveat I would add, however, is that while I'm enormously proud of the record of the last Labour government, many of those PFI deals did lumber the NHS with an enormous cost that it continues to bear. So I think we've got to tread cautiously and carefully in this area. I think there is a role for private investment, but in terms of those arrangements, that's where you've got to tread really carefully. What does treading carefully mean? Because if private investment is involved, they want to make a return, and the way that they've been making a return is at the expense of NHS trusts that have been drained of their money now ever since these PFI deals were agreed. We want to see Wes Streeting saying no to PFI. We want to see the new head of the NHS, Jim Mackey, saying no to PFI. This cannot be what we leave our grandchildren with. Not putting the money in that is needed to fix crumbling buildings, or putting in money and making us pay for it 6, 8, 27 times over down the line. It makes absolutely no sense. And it shows a real poverty of vision that this government think we are so poor that we cannot just pay for this stuff without involving the private sector.